You're not an angry person. That's what you tell yourself. That's what everyone around you believes. You're calm. Measured. The one who keeps it together when everything around you is falling apart. But here's what nobody talks about. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from never losing your temper. A specific kind of heaviness that settles into your body after you've smiled through something that deserved a reaction. A specific kind of loneliness that comes from being fine, constantly, perfectly, suspiciously fine. And somewhere underneath all that composure, something is burning. Quietly. Slowly. In a place you've learned not to look. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Anger doesn't disappear because you decide not to feel it. It doesn't dissolve because you breathe through it, distract yourself from it, or convince yourself it wasn't worth reacting to. It goes somewhere else. Deeper. Into the body. Into behavior. Into the way you interpret the world around you without ever realizing that a feeling you buried 3 years ago is still writing the story. That's repressed anger. And it might be the most misunderstood psychological force operating inside you right now. We talk about anxiety. We talk about depression. We've built entire cultural conversations around grief and trauma. But repressed anger, the slow, silent accumulation of feelings we decided were too dangerous, too ugly, or too inconvenient to express, that one stays hidden. Because it doesn't announce itself dramatically. It disguises itself as other things entirely. It looks like exhaustion after conversations that should have been simple. It looks like that disproportionate irritation you feel when someone chews too loudly or takes too long to reply to a message. It looks like the way you sometimes lie awake at night replaying interactions, mentally rewriting what you should have said, but didn't. Sound familiar? Most people reading that will nod quietly and move on. But I want you to stay with that recognition for a moment. Because those small things, those seemingly minor reactions you brush off as stress or overthinking, they're not random. They're signals. They're the emotional equivalent of a check engine light that's been blinking for months while you keep driving. Here's what's fascinating about anger specifically. Every other emotion gets social permission. We cry at movies. We laugh loudly. We share anxiety openly enough that it's become its own aesthetic. But anger, particularly in people who were raised to be good, agreeable, and low maintenance, anger becomes the forbidden one. So it goes underground. And the mind, remarkably intelligent and deeply adaptive, finds other channels for it. Channels that don't look like anger at all. Channels that make you seem fine to everyone around you, including yourself. The question isn't whether you carry repressed anger. The question is, how long has it been quietly running the show? Tell me in the comments, do you consider yourself someone who struggles to express anger? I want to know who's watching this. Here's something that will shift the way you see yourself. Repressed anger isn't a character flaw. It isn't weakness. It isn't proof that you're emotionally immature or secretly volatile. It's actually evidence of something far more specific. It's evidence of adaptation. At some point in your life, probably earlier than you realize, you learned that your anger wasn't safe. Not unsafe in an abstract sense. Unsafe in a deeply personal, lived-in sense. Maybe expressing frustration as a child brought punishment instead of understanding. Maybe you watched someone you loved lose control and decided unconsciously, I will never become that. Maybe the environment you grew up in demanded harmony so consistently that any emotion which disrupted the peace felt like a betrayal. So you adapted. You became the calm one. The mature one. The one who processes privately and presents publicly as unbothered. And for a long time, it worked. But here's what adaptation costs you. Every time you swallow anger, your nervous system registers the event anyway. The body keeps score even when the mind decides to move on. That tightness in your shoulders during a difficult conversation. The jaw you clench without noticing. The way your sleep becomes restless after a day where something felt wrong but you couldn't name it. That's not stress. That's unexpressed emotion looking for an exit. Psychologists have found something deeply revealing about people who habitually suppress anger. They don't actually experience less conflict. They experience it differently. Instead of outward friction, the conflict turns inward. It becomes self-criticism. Perfectionism. A relentless internal voice that holds you to impossible standards, because somewhere along the way, you decided that being beyond reproach was the only safe way to exist. Think about that pattern in your own life. Do you find yourself working harder than necessary to avoid giving anyone a reason to be disappointed in you? Do you over-explain your decisions before anyone questions them? Do you apologize reflexively, even in situations where you've done nothing wrong? That's not politeness. That's armor. And underneath the armor, there's almost always anger. At the situations that required you to build it. At the people who made you feel like your authentic reactions were too much. At the version of yourself that kept shrinking to keep the peace. Here's the layer that makes this genuinely fascinating. Repressed anger and deep empathy almost always exist together. The people who struggle most with expressing anger are often the same people who feel everything most intensely. They suppress not because they feel less, but because they feel more. They're acutely aware of how their emotions land on others. So they absorb instead of release. They accommodate instead of confront. They carry what should have been a shared weight, entirely alone. And that carrying has a cumulative effect. It doesn't stay contained forever. It starts leaking. Into your patience. Into your presence. Into the quiet resentment that builds toward people you genuinely love, simply because you never told them what you actually needed. That leak is the thing I want to talk about next. Because what repressed anger does to your relationships, that's where this gets really uncomfortable. If this is resonating, share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe, because we're just getting to the part that changes everything. Here's the part nobody wants to admit. The people you're most patient with in public are sometimes the people you're most quietly resentful of in private. Not because you're hypocritical. Not because your love for them isn't real. But because repressed anger doesn't discriminate. It accumulates toward whoever is closest. Whoever you've sacrificed the most for. Whoever you've edited yourself around the longest. And that resentment doesn't feel like anger. It feels like distance. Like a slow withdrawal you can't fully explain. Like caring deeply about someone but feeling inexplicably drained every time you're around them. Like going through the motions of connection while something underneath has quietly checked out. That's the relationship cost of never saying what you actually feel. And here's what makes it so painful. The other person usually doesn't know. They experience you as present because you're performing presence. You've gotten so skilled at appearing okay that even the people who love you most can't see what's eroding underneath. So the distance grows. The resentment deepens. And you stay stuck in a cycle that began long before this relationship, in rooms and dynamics you thought you'd left behind. You carry the weight of every swallowed reaction. Every moment you smiled when you should have spoken. Every time you said it's fine when it genuinely wasn't. And over months, over years, that weight changes you in ways you don't even notice until one day you realize you've become someone who expects to be disappointed. Someone who stops asking for things because asking stopped feeling worth it. That's not pessimism. That's the long-term residue of unexpressed anger reshaping your entire relationship with hope. But here's where this story turns. Because repressed anger, once you actually see it clearly, is one of the most useful pieces of self-knowledge you can possess. Every pocket of anger you've suppressed is a map. It marks exactly where a boundary was crossed that you never enforced. Where a need went unacknowledged because you decided it was too much to ask for. Where you gave parts of yourself away quietly, hoping someone would notice the cost, and nobody did. That map isn't a wound. It's a guide. The work isn't about learning to explode. It isn't about confronting everyone who contributed to this accumulation. It's far simpler and far harder than that. It's about learning to catch the feeling before it gets buried. To notice the moment something lands wrong, and instead of immediately deciding it doesn't matter, asking yourself honestly. Does it? That pause is everything. That single moment of choosing curiosity over suppression is where the pattern starts to break. Because your anger was never the problem. What you were taught to do with it, that was the problem. Anger, when you stop running from it, tells you exactly who you are. What you value. What you refuse to tolerate. Where your life has drifted from your actual truth. It's the most honest signal your psyche produces, and you've been muting it for years. The healing isn't loud. It doesn't require grand confrontations or dramatic breakthroughs. It happens in small, private moments. When you say actually, that didn't feel okay, instead of it's fine. When you let yourself feel irritated without immediately prosecuting yourself for it. When you stop apologizing for having a reaction to something that genuinely deserved one. When you stop performing calm and start choosing it consciously instead. That's the difference between suppression and genuine peace. One is exhausting. The other is freedom. And you've been exhausted for long enough. Here's what I want you to remember after this. The anger you've been carrying quietly, it was never proof that something is wrong with you. It was proof that something mattered to you deeply enough to hurt when it was ignored. That's not a flaw. That's humanity. The fire underneath you was never there to destroy anything. It was there to show you exactly where you stopped honoring yourself, and to light the way back to the person you were before you learned that your feelings were inconvenient. That person is still there. Waiting. Not with rage. But with something quieter and far more powerful. The truth of who you actually are. If this conversation opened something in you, share it with someone who needed to hear it today. And subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of psychology this channel exists to explore.